Welcome, everyone. Today we have with us Barbara Hort, author of Hollow Crown of Fire, a discovery of meaning in the coronavirus pandemic and its predecessors. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Christina.
What inspired you to write this book?
Well, when I was a little kid, I read a book called Epidemic Detectives, which opened my eyes. It was actually about the development of the CDC. It was a long time ago. And it opened my eyes to the power of pandemic disease. And something grabbed me about that. I was always interested in how much influence pandemics had over human history. And then in March of 2020, I found myself living in one with a lot of time on my hands and people asking, clearly floundering around for meaning. So I started looking and investigating what things had been written about the meanings of pandemics, the consequences, and I found very little. So I write, and I thought, well, I'll just write an essay, a long rambling tirade about the absence of investigation into the meanings of pandemics and what they've done to us. And then I kept writing. It was a long lockdown, and I rambled and had poems and quotes. And by the time the lockdown was over, I was way into it. And I hadn't really found the answer yet. So I kept writing because I'm stubborn. and then I got to where I found for myself was meaning. And by then I had a book.
So speaking of meaning, what is the meaning of your title, Hollow Crown of Fire?
That's a very good question. It comes actually from a famous speech by William Shakespeare in his play, The Life and Death of King Richard II. And that king was very narcissistic, and he was living as if he could live forever and do whatever he wanted, as many of us do. And at the end of the play, he's going to be killed, he and his close friends, and they're talking together. And he speaks this speech in which he realizes that, as Shakespeare says, nothing can we call our own but death. And then he goes on to say, for within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And it goes on to talk about how death is the one that has the final word, that we treat our bodies as if they were brass impregnable. But death comes at last and with a little pin bores through that castle wall and farewell, king. And it seemed to me that really was the essence of what all of us are faced with always in pandemic disease, that we are all faced with death. And on the cover of the book, there's this ring of flame, which is the ring of the flame around the sun during an eclipse. And they call that the corona. So it is the hollow crown of fire. That's the reason they call it a coronavirus, is because it has spikes. It makes it look like a crown. Corona means crown. But it seemed to me that the coronavirus is the hollow crown of fire. So I called it that. Of course, I'm going to get that metaphor. I'm not, other people will find that an interesting image, but mostly they'll figure out what the book is about by the subtitle.
Really, that's such a brilliant title. What were you most surprised to learn in writing this book?
Well, there was a lot of talk during the lockdown about how the pandemic was unprecedented. It's unprecedented. People may still be saying that, actually. When I started to study the history of pandemic disease, I realized that there were a lot of precedents, uncanny, unnerving precedents. And the more I got into that, a lot of what I was trying to learn was what we might see when we look back in history and what we might take from that. And there's a great deal to be learned. The philosopher, historian George Santayana said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so I was like, well, we have a lot to remember and a lot to learn.
Why is it important for us to understand the overarching impacts of pandemics?
Well, for that reason, because the more we understand about pandemic disease historically, not just in the moment, the better prepared we will be for what's happening now and what is surely going to happen again in the future. We will not be, the coronavirus pandemic is not the last pandemic of forever. And no one is thinking that, I think. Well, most people are not thinking that. So that's one reason. But the other reason is because people suffer the effects of pandemics long after the wave of death and disease has passed. In 1918, very little attention was actually paid to the pandemic because there was a war on. And by the time the pandemic wave of death had passed, that was when the war, it kind of ended the war, really, the First World War. And nobody really talked about it. Nobody actually counted the dead until 50 years later. But what we did have was an enormous global depression caused by many things, but also caused by emotional depression. And then we had, we had roaring 20s, first like, oh, thank God we're still alive. Then we had depression. Then we had a Second World War. A lot of that, one could argue, was because nobody actually paid attention to the fact that in the end, we think between 50 and 100 million people of the only 1 billion on the planet died.
Yeah,
So
that flu pandemic was incredible.
Was incredible, but it was not until 1968, a historian named Alfred Crosby, one of my heroes, actually tripped over how many people he came across these statistics, and he started counting. And so, and there was just not a lot written, and historians recognized that, but they didn't know what to make of it. So the more we speak about our feelings, our responses, what meaningful consequences there have been for each of us in this pandemic or any pandemic, the better able we will be to find our relationship to nature, to each other, to our bodies, and that's going to make us a lot better prepared to live as well as to die.
Well, that is beautiful advice that you're giving to individuals and society, and to find our own meanings, just going within and exploring it, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's what I hope to do in the book. It's not to dictate meaning, but to tell the stories, to talk about what meanings there could be. And then each reader has the opportunity to find their own points of meaning.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara Hort, for writing this brilliant and insightful and provocative book, Hollow Crown of Fire, A Discovery of Meaning in the Coronavirus Pandemic and Its Predecessors. You'll find it available on Amazon.com and independent bookstores everywhere. Thanks so much, Barbara.
Thank you, Christine.